Well, the ASEAN summit has opened in Indonesia, with members there divided on several major issues. The Southeast Asian political and trading bloc is split over Russia's war in Ukraine, Chinese territorial claims in the South China Sea, and the crisis in Myanmar. In just a moment, we'll be speaking to the President of East Timor, who's threatened to withdraw their membership application unless the conflict is resolved. But first, let's speak to our correspondent, Jessica Washington. She joins us from the summit there in Jakarta. Jessica, ASEAN has always had this central principle of non-interference. Are we seeing a renewed debate now around that?
Well, the answer to that is no. I mean, the principle of non-interference, of consensus-based decision-making, these are principles that ASEAN countries hold very close as the foundations of the bloc. And it's certainly unlikely that we would see any alteration in the near future with regard to those principles. If we're speaking specifically about the crisis in Myanmar, what's important to remember is that the group has already reached agreement, including with the Myanmar junta, and that was reached more than 2 years ago in the form of the 5-point consensus, the peace plan that ASEAN had put forward, with the recommendations among them, the chief aim, of course, to stop the violence, to begin some sort of process of meaningful dialogue, and, of course, the important access for humanitarian aid. But what we're seeing at this summit this week, the final ASEAN summit for 2023, an acknowledgement that while the agreement may have already been reached, there has certainly been some inadequacies in terms of the implementation of that plan. Earlier, we heard from the Malaysian foreign minister, who criticised the junta as being the ones that are putting forward obstacles in terms of the implementation of that plan. And a short while ago, we heard from the Indonesian President, Joko Widodo, who addressed his counterparts. And I'll just read a little bit of what he had to say. He said that for the sake of the ASEAN family, we must have the courage to evaluate ourselves, and we must also look to more practical measures to implement the 5-point consensus. So we are certainly seeing an acknowledgement from ASEAN leaders this week that there have been some inadequacies in terms of the implementation of that plan to stop the violence in Myanmar. So that's what this week of dialogue will focus on. Of course, there will be other issues, and of course, as you mentioned, there are these tensions that often get in the way of any sort of progress in terms of the ASEAN bloc. But it is worth mentioning some of what is likely to be achieved in terms of outcome. We do expect that there will be some progress on economic and trade ties. So that's where we sort of see ASEAN succeeding. But where it comes to the more contentious issues, that's certainly where the challenges remain.
Indeed, Jessica Washington at that ASEAN summit for us in Jakarta. Thank you, Jess. Well, let's remind ourselves where we are with the crisis in Myanmar. The country has faced political turmoil for years. Divisions deepened in February 2021. That's when the country's elected leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, was detained and ousted in a military coup. Widespread protests followed. Within weeks, thousands of people took to the streets opposing the junta despite threats of arrests. By late 2021, entire villages had been destroyed due to fighting between the military and armed ethnic groups. Some estimates show that since the coup, 20,000 civilians have fled to neighbouring Thailand to escape the violence, and more than 4,000 people have been killed. The military postponed the elections that it promised to hold this month, citing ongoing violence across the country. Now, there's growing concern that the instability will cause chaos beyond Myanmar's borders. Well, East Timor is due to become the newest member of ASEAN. The nation is small, but it is strategically important. The country's prime minister has said he may reconsider joining if the bloc doesn't renew efforts to solve the conflict in Myanmar. Well, we can now speak to Jose Ramos-Horta. He's the president of East Timor. He joins us now from the capital, Dili. Mr. President, thank you so much for your time with us here on Al Jazeera. I recall in January you said that there were no obstacles to your country's accession to ASEAN. In your mind, what's changed since then?
No change whatsoever. We are on track to join ASEAN. At this stage, working hard with ASEAN partners and the other partners in the implementation of the roadmap that was adopted in Labuan Bajo by the ASEAN leaders. Preference for us, I discussed with the Prime Minister, Chanan Guzman, We will join in 2025. This will give us 2 years working hard to implement, to reach the milestones laid out in the roadmap that was adopted by ASEAN leaders.
President, that all sounds very much like things are moving along, but we have been hearing these threats to pull back your bid if the Myanmar crisis in particular isn't addressed adequately. Where are those coming from if you say that things are on track?
Well, we cannot blame ASEAN for failures in persuading the military to go back to barracks, to respect the democratic rights of the people of Myanmar, to restore democracy, to free prisoners, to stop killing civilians. As we cannot blame the UN Security Council for the war in Ukraine and the inability of the UN to resolve the crisis in Ukraine or many other crises. Our Prime Minister, Guzman, was expressing his frustration, our frustration, the frustration of ASEAN countries and the international community in regards to the failure of the military in Myanmar to live up to the pledges contained in the 5-point consensus that the Tatmadaw itself agreed with ASEAN leaders. They agreed, it was not imposed on them. So the military in Myanmar, they seem not to realize the enormous harm they are doing to their own country, to their own people, doing enormous harm to the credibility of ASEAN.
Mr. President, I just want to be very, very clear. You've said that frustrations exist, both from yourself and from your Prime Minister, Zanana Gusmao. Now, I'm wondering, just for clarity, you're not threatening to withdraw your bid from ASEAN. You were expressing frustrations, but you are on track to join ASEAN.
Absolutely not. We are very grateful to ASEAN leaders for welcoming Timor-Leste. We want to join. This is our national strategic interest, our national strategic goal, commitment. We would work with ASEAN partners and any other to assist ASEAN in addressing the problems of Myanmar, but within ASEAN and not outside ASEAN.
Mr. President, you've said that your involvement on the Myanmar issue has been out of personal interests. And I understand you have a relationship, a friendship with your fellow Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, who remains in detention. I've been wondering, after the attacks on the Rohingya that we saw, she faced heavy criticism for not speaking out. Can I ask you to reflect, perhaps, on if that's changed the way that other countries engage with the crisis in Myanmar, if perhaps the West and others have taken a step back?
Well, it seemed to me at that time that those who criticized Suu Kyi, demonized Suu Kyi, did not understand that Suu Kyi had zero power over the military. She was not the president. She was not the prime minister. She was foreign affairs minister with zero power control over the military. And instead of targeting the military for the crimes perpetrated against the Rohingya, they were singling out Suu Kyi. So that's what my criticism of those who, instead of focusing on the military who launched the war against the Rohingya, they were demonizing Suu Kyi. Sorry, I couldn't agree with that. I still don't agree with that in retrospect.
You've said that ASEAN is obviously facing challenges in getting the Myanmar military to pay attention to actually implement this peace deal. We know that there are issues around the ongoing rivalry between the US and China. We're seeing those play out when we talk about the South China Sea. We know that there are also issues now around the Ukraine war. Are you concerned that with all of these divisions and other structural issues that ASEAN is perhaps becoming less relevant?
No, ASEAN will remain vital. It is in a nevralgic geographic area, 700 million people, $4 trillion economy, very strategic airspace, waterways, so no one is going to forget that. The rivalries will continue. They were always there, going back to the Vietnam War, going back to the challenges, insurgencies throughout Southeast Asia in the 60s. But ASEAN leaders were able to navigate the storm, build ASEAN, and brought prosperity, stability to the region. I am confident that they will be able eventually to stabilize Myanmar. It is in the interest of Myanmar itself to stabilize the situation. How we stabilize it? By talking to NUG, by releasing Suu Kyi, releasing all the prisoners. Because let me tell you, the military Myanmar are not winning this war. They control only 30% of the country. NUG and the forces in Myanmar control 60 to 70% of the territory. The fighting today is not like 20 years ago. 20 years ago, the fight was between the national armies, the ethnic national armies, and the army of Myanmar. Today, it's the entire people of Myanmar against the military. So they are not going to win this war. I would hope only that Russia not supplying weapons to Myanmar, and North Korea, the only two countries that are supplying weapons to Myanmar, supporting Myanmar military, are the Russians and the North Koreans.
Jose Ramos-Horta there, the President of East Timor. Thank you so much for joining us here on Al Jazeera, sir. You've made it very clear that East Timor does intend to join ASEAN. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.